Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
At the time this story began, virtual reality games were all the rage among people. And the girl who became the main character of this story played a virtual game that was very popular among girls. It was called The Young Masters of the Monster Mansion, or Raising an Angel for short. In that game, a person had to choose one of many young men who looked very much like angels. And these young men also lived in a cursed mansion. And despite their beautiful faces, they had very different characters, and not always good ones. The player's task was to protect his character from evil spirits and various monsters that could attack him. The player also had to try to make an outstanding man out of the angels. The incredible details that the player noticed during the game proved the fact that the creators had worked very hard. That game had simply amazing visuals. Many details were so well worked out that players sometimes even forgot that they were in virtual reality. Players also had the opportunity to choose their field of activity. There were more than 30 types. You could be a servant, a teacher, a priestess, a huntress, a distant relative, and everything in that vein. Even the girl in question couldn't resist all this, despite the fact that she wasn't particularly interested in such things. She began playing the role of a maid who worked in a luxurious mansion, and among the 7 young masters who were introduced, she chose Diane Redford. This guy was an incredibly handsome young gentleman with beautiful silver hair, but despite all his charms, this young gentleman was incredibly similar to a sunfish. Of course, the heroine really liked his appearance, but once again she had to start this story over again because she could not complete the task. Even though she found Diane incredibly difficult when she started playing, she chose him because she liked him more than anyone else. The girl should have immediately guessed why he was called impassible. But even when she understood, she still did not give up. As soon as she received her salary, she immediately spent almost all her money and savings on this game and played it again. As a result, after a dozen absurd deaths, she still did not give up. The girl again paid a lot of money to replay the game and was seriously determined to finish it. She had to help Diane live until he was 16, then the girl considered that her mission would be accomplished. But that time she also failed, because the guy simply died when she left him alone for a short time. Several times she asked him to stay on the bed. It was a safe zone, but Diane, of course, did not listen to her. And the girl was simply furious, not understanding why he even went outside and crossed the river. When his death occurred, the girl heard a strange voice above her. She immediately raised her head and saw a silhouette in very dark clothing. The voice was addressing the girl. It was incredibly happy that Diane was finally dead. And also this voice was saying that she was now completely alone again. This silhouette decided to kill her too, so that the girl would no longer be so lonely. Of course, when she heard all this, she was simply furious, not understanding how he could mock her at all. But soon, when she wanted to take revenge on this unfortunate voice, a menu appeared before her eyes. This menu asked if she wanted to save the video from the episode she had just watched. She was already about to actually quit this game because she understood that she would never be able to complete it anyway. The girl considered the developers of this wonderful game to be scoundrels because she could not believe that for many years she could not finish this game. When she killed her favorite character, Diana, again, she finally decided that she really should quit playing. But before she gave the final answer to this game, she looked at the guy who was lying next to her, completely dead. She felt incredibly sorry for him, even though he was just a fictional character. She had spent many years with him and had already gotten used to and attached to this boy. She understood that for the sake of her own well-being and the preservation of her budget, it would be better for her to simply give up on yet another unsuccessful attempt to save this man. There was an incredibly big and long debate in her head. She kept thinking and thinking about what she should do. Should she quit the game and do something else, or not quit and stay with her favorite character until she beats it? Before making her final decision, the girl stroked her favorite character's face and quietly told him not to worry. She hoped that next time everything would work out. The girl didn't care at all what the number of attempts would be. The most important thing for her was to save Diana's life. Of course, she had already tried playing other games more than once. However, none of them could interest her as much as this virtual simulator. Just as she was about to press the game's restart button, the ominous voice appeared again and said that he would entrust her with one task. And then he tied her hands with a whip. Of course, the poor girl immediately got scared. She didn't understand what was going on and why she was being tied up. These whips with thorns wrapped around her more and more, and she could no longer move. Of course, the girl decided that this was some kind of breakdown in the game, but soon she lost consciousness. And when she opened her eyes the next time, she didn't understand where she was for a while. Looking around, she noticed that she was standing in an estate. Another maid with dark hair and incredibly beautiful ruby eyes spoke up. This girl called out to Lady Rin, allowing her to come in. When the female protagonist, who was standing behind, heard all this, she immediately realized that she had somehow ended up at the beginning of the game. Of course, she didn't have time to press restart then, but due to a breakdown in the game, she was thrown to the very first episode. The maid who was standing in front entered the room and addressed young Master Dayan, saying that a new teacher had come to see him. The boy was not happy about this news at all. He was simply furious, not understanding why the woman came only at that moment. And he also told the maid that it was already late and she needed to be driven away. The main character just stood there and didn't understand what was going on, because she had originally chosen the role of a maid and now somehow ended up being a teacher. But soon the doors to the room opened and the woman went inside. There she saw Dayan standing near the open window. He was small but still so beautiful. For a moment, Dayan didn't turn around, but soon he looked at his new teacher with disgust, not understanding how he could be 5 minutes late. The boy said that she shouldn't have been late on her first day at work, and he also had some doubts about her competence, because she should be able to perform her job duties well. As soon as the girl saw Dayan, her heart immediately began to beat much faster. Of course, she had seen this scene many times, but she was still touched as if it were the first time. She did not utter a single word. Then the maid who had let the girl in bowed and asked the master's forgiveness. She explained that there had been some confusion, so they had to wait a little. After that, the maid turned to the heroine. She called her Miss Rin and said that the woman needed to meet because this was young Master Dayan, whom she would now take care of. When Dayan heard her name, he immediately asked what her last name was. The maid didn't know, so she remained awkwardly silent. However, Rin intervened in their conversation and stated her last name. It was Lugard. Of course, the girl thought Dayan was incredibly cute. However, she hated mistakes in games, so her last name was a secret code for fixing everything. For a while, everyone in the room was awkwardly silent. The boy was the first to break the silence and asked if she was from the north, because he noticed that her manner of speech was also different. Rin immediately replied that it wasn't her last name at all, and she didn't understand why she didn't log out of the game, since it was a secret code for such cases. After thinking for a while, the girl realized that if this really was the first scene of the game, then the maid who stood next to them must have done something terrible. And it really was like that. The maid, who had been normal a few minutes ago, turned into a monster. She grabbed a vase that was standing nearby and immediately threw it at the master. Rin managed to react in time. She moved the boy aside so that the fragments did not even touch him. And Dayan, turning his head to the side, saw the maid, who was normal, but then she turned into the most terrible monster who wanted to kill everyone. Dayan was so surprised that he couldn't even utter a single word. He just crawled back along the floor so that this woman wouldn't come near him. Rin then took control of the situation. She saw the swords hanging behind her and immediately knew that she had to act. When Dayan regained his speech, he asked in surprise what had happened to the maid Moroz, because she had always been with him, and now she was terrible. Rin really was going to use those swords to move on, but before that, she threw a blanket over the guy. The girl did this so that little Dayan would not see all this horror, because he was still very small, and it was impossible to inflict such a cruel injury on him. This servant Frost immediately growled loudly, She already wanted to deal with all these pathetic people and taste their flesh. But the maid didn't have time to do anything, because Rin immediately ran for a weapon to use it and defeat this pathetic monster. The girl grabbed the sword and jumped over the maid, so she found herself in a very advantageous position to attack. Of course, for her it was easy as pie, because she had already gone through this scene a great many times, so she knew it by heart. So Rin very easily cut off this maid's head, thinking that now she would not have to do anything else. She herself had to move to another episode. Rin just stood there for a while, but when the blood didn't start to disappear like usual, she became very wary. Actually, the previous times, flowers would start appearing in place of this maid, and she didn't look so horrible anymore. But now that Rin had killed her, all the floors were covered in blood that wouldn't be cleaned up. The girl was incredibly wary. She didn't know what to do now because she couldn't allow the boy to see her covered in blood and that horrible corpse of his maid, with whom he had lived his whole life. Rin didn't understand what was going on at all, or why everything was different from the original playthrough. But at that moment, Dayan began to take off his blanket and in a trembling, quiet voice asked his new teacher if she had killed her. In fact, in the past, so-called corpse flowers bloomed around the murdered maid. These corpse flowers literally mean exactly that. They bloom right on the corpse itself. When a person died in the game, they bloomed red, but when monsters passed away, the flowers turned black. The maid who turned into a monster, the scent of blood and those corpse flowers. All of this was so realistic that some people even felt very sick while playing. However, now that this hadn't happened during Rin's playthrough, she found it all incredibly strange and knew that it was some kind of mistake. When the girl recalled Dayan's death for the last time, she also remembered some strange words that she heard. Someone was going to give her something to do. And after analyzing the situation more closely, Rin realized that she had somehow been transported into the game world. Immediately after that incident, the maids came to them. They took the girl and the boy into another room, poured tea, and walked around them to calm them down and give them support. One of the head maids approached Rin and said that they would soon finish cleaning the room, so she and the guy should just wait a little in the guest room, and then they could go back. The girl smiled and immediately said that everything was fine and they could take their time, and even stay longer if necessary. But when she turned her gaze to Dayan, she immediately felt no longer in the mood for fun. She saw his dejected face and immediately asked the maids to try to finish as quickly as possible, because he was too scared. Of course, in situations like this, she would just move on to the next episode and forget about it all. She wouldn't have to go through all of this. However, that was no longer possible. All the time Rin sat and tried in every possible way to open at least the menu settings or even just exit. But of course, she did not succeed. The girl didn't know what had happened and how long this mistake would last. However, she wasn't even told anything, how it had happened, and how soon it would end. All this time, they sat with the guy in a very awkward silence, and Rin noticed that he kept as far away from her as possible, so she realized that the boy was simply afraid of her. This made her feel incredibly hurt because in reality she is not a bad person. But the girl knew that he was simply very scared and therefore simply could not behave normally or even speak elementarily. She remained silent for a while, but then turned to the maid who was standing nearby and asked if they could bring a vase of holy water and more warm tea. The maid, of course, was a little surprised by such a request, but she immediately fulfilled it. And after some time, the table began to play with completely different colors. There appeared cakes, which the young gentleman loved very much, fresh warm tea, and also a vase with beautiful flowers, which pleased not only the eye, but also the soul. After that, the maid handed Lady Rin a towel and said that it would be best for her to wipe her face after all. As soon as the girl saw him, she immediately thanked the maid because she completely forgot that she was covered in blood. Of course, it was not surprising that Dayan was scared, because she also saw such a frank scene for the first time. Because when she played the game all the previous times, she did not even watch it to the end, but simply moved on to the next level. When the girl somehow wiped her face, she turned to the guy and asked if maybe they should start getting to know each other again, since the first time it didn't work out very well. However, before Dayan could say anything in response, another boy suddenly entered the room. That boy was the angel of room 2, and his name was Menuel. He walked forward smiling and said that he had heard that a teacher had come to room 7, so he decided to look in, and it was such a mess. In fact, this young man who reeked of luxury was Menuel, and he was also the most popular character, the one most often chosen. Rin watched a lot of videos on the game's walkthrough, and the video bloggers mostly played it because of this character. Of course, this guy was also her second favorite, so every time she lost, she had a wild desire to change Dayan for him. Menuel asked his friend if it was true that the new teacher had killed the monster that was the servant. But when the guy came closer and saw a lot of blood on Rin's face and in principle on her clothes, he realized that it was really true. He couldn't even imagine that this woman could be so useful, so he asked her what her name was. The boy behaved inappropriately for his age and was sometimes even very rude. So Dayan, who was quite a jealous guy, suddenly became very angry. He did not understand why this guy suddenly decided to be so interested in his own teacher. Menuel took it quite normally. He only wondered why the guy was so worked up, since it was just a name, and he didn't want to take her away from him. Rin sat silently the whole time. She continued to drink her tea, but she couldn't understand where such a strange and tense atmosphere between the boys came from. But Menuel, smiling, also said that if he was really afraid that he might take her away from him, then he was doing the right thing because they were on different levels, and therefore she might well prefer another. When Dayan heard all this, he was very angry because he did not understand why the guy was acting so arrogant. But he was not even able to answer anything in his defense because he had quite low self-esteem. Rin was actually very angry with Menuel herself because she didn't understand why he was behaving so brazenly. But she even felt pleased with how her favorite character reacted because she assumed that he didn't want to part with her. Of course, she really liked this reaction, and she was no longer so angry about this breakdown that happened, because if it had been an ordinary game, she would never have seen it. But sometime later, Menuel turned to the woman, calling her a new girl, and asked if perhaps she should leave this loser and become his tutor. Dayan could no longer stand such behavior. He quickly got up from the table and started shouting loudly. The boy asked him not to talk nonsense because she was his teacher, and he did not dare take her away. There was an incredibly tense atmosphere between the boys that Rin didn't know how to resolve. Still, she decided to intervene before it was too late, and, smiling, asked that they not quarrel. Both pulled themselves together and also learned to control their emotions. Manuel, smiling maliciously, immediately turned to Dayan and said that this still concerned him and he should calm down, otherwise he would get angry like an idiot. But the boy continued to insist on his own and said that he was simply jealous of him. So all these arguments were completely useless, so he decided to simply not talk to him. Rin remained silent. She knew that if she continued to interfere in their argument, she might end up the one who got the brunt, so she just watched. After some time, Manuel took a chair that was nearby and sat down at the table with them. He immediately turned to the new girl and asked her to answer honestly who was first in her mind. Rin, of course, did not expect to hear such a bold question. But before she could even give an answer, Manuel continued speaking. He said that of course it had to be him, because he was known for his good relationships with all the teachers, and she even chose room 7 only because she had no other options. Of course, Manuel's self-confidence was simply off the charts, and Dayan, hearing all this, became even more depressed. He had enough of that trauma with the maid, so he did not interfere anymore, but only dug deeper and deeper into himself. Of course, Rin was ready to immediately break down and run to hug the guy, saying that he was the best, and she was incredibly sorry that the boy had to hear all these terrible words. But she answered rather reservedly and calmly, saying that she chose Dayan only because she wanted it herself. And even if there were other options, she would still choose room 7. When the boy heard this, he looked at his teacher with hope. He even had tears in his eyes from happiness because he could not believe his luck. Manuel himself was very surprised then. He screamed, saying that this simply could not be, because he did not understand how Diane could be the favorite for a girl. Of course, raising Diane was quite difficult, so he was not so popular among the players, and not only, but if she really said that, it would be too much. So the girl held back and answered rather reservedly. Manuel, in order to at least slightly save his reputation, immediately asked who was in second place for her then. Without thinking, the girl immediately said the same name. Then the guy asked who was in third place. Rin was already starting to like this situation, so with a mocking smile on her face, she said that, of course, it was Diane. In fact, she once had the idea to change her character, but it was only for a moment. For her, Diane always came first, but of course there were other characters she liked. However, she certainly didn't dare say something like that in front of her favorite, because it would have been too impolite and mean. So Rin said with a very confident voice that no matter how many candidates she had, she would still always choose Diane because he was the best, in her opinion. Of course, she had already chosen him 43 times, and all this time he had died. But she still did not give up, and continued to make a choice in his favor. Manuel was absolutely furious at that moment. He realized that she had no understanding of people at all, since she was making a choice that was not in his favor. So, getting up from his seat, he walked out, slamming the door behind him, and said that he did not need such an idiot. When Rin and the guy were alone, they were silent for a while. Diane tried to understand if it was all true. What had happened? And to be completely sure, he asked with hope in his gaze whether he really was in first place for her. Rin, of course, said that it was, and even couldn't hold back her tears. She thought he was incredibly cute and simply couldn't answer otherwise. She looked at this beautiful little boy who was in a very fragile condition and said that of course the young master would always be the best and most beautiful for her. When the boy heard this, he looked at her without fear, but even with admiration and slight love. It was a huge relief for Rin, because if they hadn't gotten along from the start, it would have been a failure. So she thought that this was the perfect moment to introduce herself again. So she gave him her name and said that she would take care of him from now on. Diane smiled himself. He said his name and replied that he really wanted to try to improve relations with her, because she had saved his life after all. The boy also said that her manner of speech was more like that of a maid, and that was why he was very surprised, because she was, after all, a teacher. But for the girl, of course, this was not a surprise, because she had been playing as a maid for a very long time. So she decided to ask again if he really didn't like it that much, because it was so convenient for her to talk, and she didn't want to change. Diane actually replied that he didn't care at all, so the girl could now speak as she was used to. So Rin was very happy that she wouldn't have to relearn. But the girl also had a new problem. She didn't know what a teacher does at all, because it was the first time she had heard of such a position. Rin knew that if she asked the boy directly about it, it would look rather strange, because he was looking at her with such trust. And if she made it clear that she didn't know who the teacher was, he would definitely be upset. So she decided that she would find out later whether it was some kind of bug or just a new option. Rin decided to talk to him about what happened, and so she asked if he knew who that maid was. Of course, the boy knew it was a monster and asked if that was true. When Rin nodded her head in agreement, he replied that he was very surprised because it was the first time he saw it so close, so he was confused and could not stand up for himself. He also asked the girl not to think that he could be scared so easily. This is not true at all. Rin smiled and immediately said that she wouldn't have thought that, because their young master was the bravest of them all. So of course he just didn't expect it a little, so he was confused. It happens to everyone. Diane continued to defend his honor and said that he was not as weak as he seemed. He was just surprised, so he could not do anything, but next time he would definitely defend not only himself, but also his teacher. Rin couldn't believe that he actually said those words. It was as if they had captured her heart completely, so for a while she just froze and didn't say anything. But soon she finally came to her senses and said that it was very sweet. He's incredibly kind and sensitive, so she is very glad that she can now be near him. Rin even said that he was like a fairy who could grant any wish. As soon as Diane heard this, he became wary. He did not understand whether she really called him cute and compared him to a fairy. Of course, she talked about him, but soon the girl overcame her feelings and, asking for forgiveness, said that she simply could not resist, because he was such a cutie that she really wanted to hug him. She would have loved to capture this moment, but due to a terrible mistake, she couldn't do anything, so the girl had to enjoy just looking at it once. Rin thought it was incredibly cute that he was embarrassed, so they spent the rest of the time having heart-to-heart talks, laughing and telling various funny stories. Soon a maid came to them, bowed, turned to the mistress and said that if the woman had already finished her acquaintance, then she would accompany her to the room so that she could settle in there. Diane immediately stood up from his seat and said that he wanted to rest, so he would go. When Rin heard this, she was even very surprised. She had hoped that he would stay a little longer so that they could continue their conversation. However, the boy was still incredibly embarrassed by this acquaintance, so he said that they had better postpone their conversation until later, when he had rested and began to escort his new teacher out the door. Rin was a little surprised by his behavior, but she understood that it was all because he was very embarrassed. So, after saying goodbye to him, she wished him a good rest and then went to her room. As soon as the maid escorted her there, looking around, Rin concluded that everything was the same as the previous times. However, she still did not receive a response from the system, and she had asked for so much. She didn't understand how long this error would last, but it was really stressing her out, because she wanted to get out and do her own thing at the very least. Usually, after a few hours, the system would automatically kick a person out of the game, and Rin couldn't believe that she would have to wait 2 whole days for the system to restart. Of course, real time and time in the game were calculated differently. In reality, 2 days can last even about half a month in the game. Rin immediately fell onto the bed. She really wanted people to sort out this error as soon as possible, because she had to go to work very soon and she couldn't get out. As soon as the girl closed her eyes, she immediately remembered the picture of how she was being wrapped in bonds and that terrible voice was speaking. So it was no wonder that she had a lot of doubts about whether it was really a simple mistake. But even if it wasn't, she didn't know what to do in that case. She decided that this could not go on any longer. She had to think of something and act somehow. The first thing the girl did was go to the bathroom to finally wash off all the blood and dirt. Everything around her seemed incredibly true, as if the game had actually become reality. Many moments were not missed, and besides, she was very confused by the fact that even the corpse was different. Rin looked at herself in the mirror and realized that this was simply impossible. Her face was the same as in the game. And if she had been transported there alive, the girl believed that it should have been her real appearance. She was also incredibly glad that this terrible mistake in the game at least did not spoil her face, and she still remained a beauty. She worked so hard to perfect her appearance that she would be incredibly upset if something happened to her. After Rin had completely washed the blood off her hands and face, she returned back to the room and decided to take a good look at it. As soon as she glanced towards the closet, she saw some unusual outfit there. The girl had never seen anything like it before, so it surprised her very much. The clothes were indeed unusual, and all because it was a special uniform for a teacher. Rin immediately went to the closet in search of one very important thing, because the previous time she played the game, this thing was there. She was looking for the suitcase that was given to all players at the very beginning. It was usually on the bed, so that even a newbie could see it and use it. In fact, that suitcase contained weapons, personal belongings, and a special instruction book that described each role and how to play it. That's why Rin really wanted to look into that book to understand what the role of the educator was. Here, the girl suddenly even suggested that the teacher could play the same role as the parents, but she still wasn't completely sure. Rin took her new clothes off the hanger. She knew it was a special uniform for this position. Of course, she wanted to try them on to see how she would look in them. But the girl was still alarmed by the fact that in all those times she had played the game, this was the first time she had heard of such a field of activity. She even assumed that she had recently been introduced into the game, and that was precisely why the error had occurred. Rin was very upset that all the things she had accumulated had simply disappeared, and she even had limited items that she had bought for an extra fee. She was also going to start a riot if, when everything was fine, she didn't get anything back. She was going to get justice, because she had invested a lot of money in this game. The girl decided to try on the clothes a little later, so she hung them back up. She thought she could go outside to look for the suitcase. Since there was a bug in the game, maybe it would appear in a different place. When the girl went outside, she noticed that there was absolutely no one around, and there was no suitcase either. She really hoped that the maids knew something about the bag. But whenever she approached them and asked about it, they couldn't give her any useful answers. Rin saw one of the maids looking very scared, and she knew it was most likely because she killed one of the other maids who had turned into a monster. The maids told her that they had last seen the suitcase in the room. Of course, Rin was very upset about not being able to find it. The instruction book was not as important to her as the weapon that could save her life. Passing by the columns, the girl suddenly saw a very interesting object hanging on the wall. She immediately went up to it, and taking it off the wall, took it in her hands. It was a rather ancient weapon, and Rin decided to take it with her for the time being, thinking that it might suit her. When the girl was about to return back to the room, some strange little box suddenly fell at her feet. She quickly picked it up and didn't understand where this little box had rolled from, because there wasn't a single person nearby. But as soon as Rin raised her head up, she saw another boy in front of her. He had a book in his hands, and he looked very shy and excited. Of course, she immediately recognized that this person was the angel of the first room. His name was Ruska. In fact, before she could only meet him by choosing a special route for this, but here he appeared on her way, along with the book. So Rin assumed that this was also some kind of mistake. The girl immediately handed the box to the boy and told him not to drop it again, because it might be a valuable thing. But it wasn't Ruska who took the box. It was his nanny who very rudely took it from the girl. And the woman would very much like Rin to never come near her child again, much less touch his things. Rin, of course, continued to smile, but the girl did not understand who this stranger was and why she was looking at her so angrily. So she explained to the woman that she only wanted to give the boy something that he had accidentally dropped, and she didn't consider it a crime. This woman was incredibly angry and had a rude voice, looking down on Rin, and said that she could decide for herself whether to pick up what had fallen or whether this thing should just be thrown away. She just threw the box on the floor, saying that she couldn't be sure what the woman had done with it, so of course she couldn't just give it to the child. As soon as Rin saw such behavior, she, of course, was indignant. She did not understand how a woman could, without reason, accuse a completely innocent person who simply decided to help. But after that, the woman who was his nanny and was dressed all in black told Ruska that it was time for them to go, and also that he had better stay away from this strange woman. At that moment, they turned around and started to leave, without saying a single word to Rin, without even saying goodbye. Of course, the girl was perplexed. Do such characters even exist? She had never encountered anything like this before. All the maids she had worked with before were very friendly and welcoming. Rin saw this woman for the first time and even assumed that she was a new character. But of course, she did not like her at all, because the stranger was incredibly rude and ignorant. Soon after, the girl went to the backyard of the mansion to look for some things there. When she entered a small thicket of the forest, she saw a statue of a lion nearby. As soon as she came closer to it, she immediately remembered that what she was looking for was right there. In fact, she was looking for a weapon, and as soon as the girl moved the lion statue aside, she saw a beautiful pistol lying under the statue. She was very happy when she saw it. Of course, the girl had to use it as early as the 10th episode, but she decided to change the rules a little for her own protection. While she was standing in those bushes, She saw several boys not far from her who were running through the forest and loudly arguing about something. One of the children said that it was incredibly funny, and the other agreed and said that it was incredibly funny to watch Cheshi fall into the pond. Rina immediately became interested in these conversations, so she came closer to at least hear better, but she could not see the face. Also, the girl heard this strange name for the first time, but she didn't linger there for long. Since she had already found the weapon, she had to go back because Diane was probably already tired of waiting. As soon as Rin came out of the bushes, she turned her head to the side and saw the silhouette of a person. She immediately froze because she was very scared. Looking closer, she realized that this person was some guy. He was completely wet and just standing motionless. Because of this strange behavior, Rin immediately thought that it was a monster again and was very glad that she immediately took the weapon because now it would be easier for her to defend herself. However, this strange stranger smiled and greeted the girl. He then came closer so that she could finally see him as a whole. The guy said that he had heard about her before and also asked if it was true that she was the new teacher from the 7th room. Rin immediately calmed down. She realized that, most likely, it was not a monster, but it scared her quite a bit because she almost even shot it. After greeting him, the girl said that it was indeed her, and then she took a closer look at the guy, who had a simply amazing appearance. Because the man was wet, his beautiful white shirt stuck to his very muscular body, and he moved in general very gracefully and attractively. Rin didn't know this character, so she assumed that he was probably also a new one. It was unexpected, but his body really impressed the girl. She realized that his muscles were very pumped up and strong, so she concluded that this guy was not just a worker. The stranger noticed seaweed on his shoulder, so he quickly removed it, and coming closer to her, said that he was very glad to meet her. The man was actually very surprised for the first time when he heard that there was finally some kind of teacher in the 7th room. With a rather friendly smile on his face, he continued to stand in front of the girl and also asked if she was really lost. He made this conclusion because she was completely alone in the forest. Rin, in order not to give away her true intentions, said that everything was indeed so. Of course, she could not admit to him that she had come into the forest thicket in order to take the weapon for herself. The man was immediately happy when he heard such an answer. He said that he thought so because the mansion was simply huge, so at first everyone got lost. He pointed towards the estate that was visible behind him and offered to show her around and show her the surrounding area along the way if she didn't mind, of course. The girl immediately smiled and, clapping her hands, said that she would gladly agree to this proposal. But she did this only out of politeness and in order not to arouse suspicion towards her person. She had played that game more than once, and so this mansion was already like a home to her. So she knew all the secret passages, and getting back from the forest was no problem for her. After that, Rin noticed that all his clothes were wet and asked if he would like to go in and change first, since the excursion could be rescheduled for another time. The man immediately apologized to her for having to see him in such a state. He simply explained that he was getting the children a ball that had fallen into the pond, and so he had to climb in directly. But the stranger still did not want to go to the estate to change clothes. He explained that it was very warm outside, so the clothes should dry pretty quickly. Rin realized that arguing with him was completely useless. So soon they set off on an impromptu tour of the entire estate. As they walked a little further in awkward silence, the man remembered that he had not introduced himself, so he gave his name. This fine fellow's name was Cheshi, and he arrived at the estate a year ago. Of course, the girl did not hear him very carefully. After all, they were quite close, and she was looking at his beautiful appearance almost all the time. But soon she introduced herself. As soon as Cheshi heard this name, he smiled and said that she was very beautiful, and also replied that he was very glad to welcome her to the mansion. After some time, they walked further and further. Cheshi moved forward, and Rin realized that she saw this character for the first time, and she even became interested in what role he played. When Cheshi noticed that she was behind him, he immediately stopped, and turning to her, asked if he had been walking too fast. Rin didn't answer his question right away, as she was deep in her thoughts, but she said that he wasn't walking fast at all. She was just a little behind. Cheshi smiled constantly. He complimented her abilities, because he heard that she got rid of a monster on the very first day. The girl was a little embarrassed, because she was not used to receiving compliments from such handsome men, and replied that there was nothing wrong with that, because there was only one monster, and anyone could have handled it. But Cheshi persisted. He said that since she killed him on her own, it was really amazing. In fact, in the game the girl played, there were monsters and evil spirits that hunted the young men from the mansion. Evil spirits were called by the Latin word demons, and frost in Latin was a corpse, death, destruction. They were all dangerous, just like their names. However, getting rid of that maid was not difficult at all, because Rin acted according to the instructions that had been developed. She had repeated this instruction more than once, but of course she couldn't tell this man about it, because he wouldn't understand her anyway, and perhaps would even consider her crazy. There was an awkward silence between them for a while, and Cheshi broke it by saying that the rumors weren't lying after all, because he had also heard that she had completed an elite course. When the girl heard about this, she was very surprised and immediately asked, "Did they really say that?" The man said, smiling, that of course everyone was interested when they learned that a new tutor had arrived in the 7th room. However, they knew nothing for sure, only some rumors that were circulating throughout the estate. But he concluded that what people said was true after all, since she was able to deal with the monster so easily. Rin only laughed awkwardly in response. In fact, due to this strange error, she didn't know the new settings, so she couldn't openly say that it was all a lie. She had never heard of any elite courses before, and realized that apparently caregivers were not hired by interview, like ordinary maids. But Cheshi explained that because of her popularity, many teachers became interested in getting to know her, and if she really was an elite, she should know the teacher from the 4th room well. He went on, since they had stopped for a short time, and said that she could certainly know her, but he also specified that this woman was from Stella. Rin didn't understand all these names. She assumed that the elite group of educators was probably called Stella, but she was probably in some other group. They walked in silence for a while, and then Cheshi remembered that he had not told her about one very important piece of news that he wanted to share. With a smile on his face, the man asked her if she knew that a welcoming party was to take place that evening in her honor. Of course, Rin had never heard of this before, so she didn't answer the question. And the man didn't suspect anything and said that they could chat more about different things there, so he really hoped that she would come to her own party after all. Rin smiled and said that she was also very happy about this, and replied that she was looking forward to the evening with great impatience. However, at that moment one man approached them, and as soon as the girl saw him, she was very surprised. And all because this person turned out to be Manuel. He turned to Cheshi and in a rough voice asked why the guy was with this terrible new girl. After that, the boy began to glare at Rin, because he had already begun to dislike her after the incident when she refused him. Of course, he had a look of confusion, because he thought that Rin would be kicked out after the first day. But the girl was quite friendly. She didn't understand, of course, why Manuel was angry all the time, but she didn't make the situation worse. The boy continued yelling at Cheshi again, not understanding what he was doing next to the new girl. After all, he still had a lot of work to do, and he wondered if the guy was going to hurry up a little to get everything done. Rin was surprised that the two even knew each other, but she didn't say anything. Cheshi just smiled and said that he was just about to go and do his duties. The girl remained standing behind and still did not understand why Manuel suddenly started looking for Cheshi. She was afraid to even imagine that this man could be his tutor. But before leaving for good, the man turned to her and said that he would still show her the mansion a little later because he had some urgent business to do. Rin still decided to find out if her assumption was correct, so she asked Mr. Cheshi, was he really a teacher too? The man suddenly asked in surprise, had he not introduced himself to her? And then, bowing, he said that he was responsible for Manuel's upbringing from the 2nd room. Of course, the girl was very surprised by all this. But soon she began to return to her room, and seeing that the sun was already setting, she realized that it was too late to go outside again. All this time she couldn't get Cheshi out of her head. He was certainly incredibly kind to her, but for some reason he seemed rather strange to her. The girl was too careless and was happy about the appearance of new characters, but this could have turned out to be a bad decision for her. Of course, she had no problem getting her most important weapon, so she decided to return to Dion immediately so that nothing would happen to him by then. As soon as she was about to enter his room, she suddenly heard a scream. It was the maid who was addressing her. Rin looked at her in surprise, and the maid said in a trembling voice that they had a very big problem. She ran incredibly fast to make it. The maid immediately told about the problem that happened to Mr. Dan, and the girl, hearing this, was very surprised. She was, of course, very upset, because she did not think that the story of the moonfish could begin so quickly, and from that moment on, she could no longer leave him alone for a minute. She ran quite quickly to the place where the maid had pointed out to her, and as soon as she ran into the room, she immediately asked the young master what had happened. The boy was lying on the bed at the time. He immediately turned away from his nanny and replied that there was nothing to worry about. He was just a little bruised, so she shouldn't worry so much. He decided to immediately change the subject of the conversation so that she would not get hung up on his problem, and asked where she had gone. Since she was not in the room, he checked. Rin replied that her special suitcase was missing, so she went outside to look for it. But at that moment, the girl leaned over to his leg and saw a very large wound there. She was very surprised and even upset. Rin began to scream loudly, wondering how he managed to get hurt in such a short time, because there should not have been any dangerous things in the mansion. The boy sighed heavily and didn't even look her in the eye. He replied that there was nothing to worry about, he just fell and hurt himself. He also explained that it wasn't even a wound, so she shouldn't worry too much. In reality, Rin should have been worried because Diane was the type of character who could get hurt incredibly easily due to his carelessness. But she still thought that nothing more would happen that day, since she had already dealt with the monster servant. However, the girl was very wrong. Frowning, Rin turned to him and said that in the future, she should always be by his side so that he would never get hurt again. When she saw how much pain Diana was in, she went to Rose and tore off a petal. The girl said that the bandage was just awful, so she replied that she would definitely bandage it. But for her, there was at least something joyful, because despite the fact that the boy was often injured and constantly got into trouble, she expanded her medical knowledge and improved her treatment skills. It wasn't that there wasn't a character in the mansion who was a healer, it was just that Rin considered everyone to be some kind of swindlers who couldn't even tie a normal child's leg. When Diane saw how skillfully she bandaged his injured leg, he was very surprised. In fact, he had never seen such a method of bandaging before, but he noticed that it became even more convenient. Due to an error, all the settings in the girl's game were reset, so at that moment, her healing skills were only somewhere at level 1. Therefore, Rin knew that she needed to collect experience points by healing the maids who got hurt while walking, so that she could be even better in the future. When the bandaging was finished, she decided to find out all the details and asked if he really said that he fell when he was walking to her room. Diane felt very awkward talking about all this. He said that it really happened because he wanted to go with her to the welcome banquet, but accidentally did not see the obstacle there and tripped. Rin then sighed heavily and said that she was ready to do absolutely anything she wanted. However, because of the bruise, they would still have to rest a little and support the leg at rest. As soon as the guy heard this, he immediately got angry. He asked if this was really why she wouldn't go to the banquet. He also replied that he was fine and she shouldn't worry. But Rin wasn't going to listen to him. She said that if he really wanted to go that badly, she had one way. Giggling, she asked if she should ask out loud to prepare crutches or a wheelchair. But Diane replied that he did not want that, because then everyone would know that something was wrong with him and that he was somehow different. When he said his last words, he was very depressed because he could even imagine how they would mock him because of this. Diane felt that if he walked on crutches or even in a wheelchair, he would appear weak, and he didn't want that more than anything. When Rin heard these words, she immediately began to be touched, because her beautiful boy wants to look strong in front of others, even in such a dejected state. In her opinion, he looked very cute. They were silent for a while, and then he said that in that case she would still have to go to this celebration alone. Rin, hearing this, was very indignant. She even started screaming, wondering how she could just leave like that, leaving him completely alone. Diane replied that he wasn't so bad that he needed someone to sit next to him all the time, so she could go to the celebration without any worries. He explained that this was a banquet in her honor, so it was impossible for the main character of this celebration not to appear. Rin felt incredibly sad that he said it in such a dejected voice, but she could even understand his feelings. The girl herself was interested in how the welcoming banquet would go. However, she had already played this game more than once, and even if she missed it at that moment, she would be able to attend it later if she chose a different role for herself. However, for Diane, this was the only day. In addition, in this game, he was the only one who had not had a tutor for a long time, so this banquet was very special for him. Sighing heavily, Rena realized that she couldn't do anything about it, so she didn't know what else to do. The boy already wanted to say that when she returned from the banquet, they could spend time together. But he did not have time to finish because his teacher said that she would hug him and they would definitely go there together. Diane, hearing this, was very surprised and asked what she was saying. Rin explained her position by saying that he himself said that he didn't want others to know that he was injured. So she had a very good idea of how to do it differently. She decided to say that she was very happy to become his caregiver, so she decided to go to the banquet with him, putting him in a carrier. When Diane heard that they wanted to put him in a carrier, he was horrified. But Rin was very happy with her wonderful idea and already wanted to run to implement it. The guy quickly stopped her, saying that this should not happen. He would never agree to such a decision. Rin was very upset when he so abruptly rejected her wonderful idea. She really thought it was a very good option. For a while, Diane continued to insist on his own and said that he did not agree. Therefore, it was better for her to go without him than with him in a carrier. When evening came, Rin changed into her uniform, which was intended for a teacher. The girl could have carried him to the dining room without any problems, but she was very sorry that he still did not agree to this option. When she suggested this, she realized that he was even more upset. The boy started yelling at her, saying that he could be alone so she should go to that party. He explained his categorical position. Such a banquet happens only once, so she could not miss it under any circumstances. Of course, Rin would have been much happier if they had gone together. However, she couldn't help it. All the options the girl had didn't please Diane. He said he didn't want to appear weak in front of others. So she went to the celebration, deciding to have fun for him and come back quickly. This holiday was a great opportunity for her because other educators were supposed to gather there, so she would be able to gather as much information as possible. As soon as she entered, she saw a lot of people there and could not believe that they actually came for her. The girl immediately saw that everyone was looking at her, so she even said hello to strangers. But in principle, everyone there was a stranger, because they were new characters that she had never met before. However, in all this crowd, she also saw familiar faces. Joshua was there, and upon seeing Lady Rin, he immediately smiled and greeted her. She also saw Russo's teacher there, who looked down on her, as well as some other new characters who were also very skeptical of her. She couldn't believe that it was really a welcoming banquet, because the people there were completely mean to her. However, the little boy decided to diffuse the situation, and seeing the girl, he smiled and asked, "Is this really the same new teacher from room number 7? The adult woman who was sitting next to him immediately became indignant and told Viva that he couldn't behave like that. The boy sighed heavily and asked, "Can't he even say hello anymore?" After all, he thought that greeting people was very polite. His teacher didn't answer this, and Rin, meanwhile, had already approached Viva and, smiling, said that everything was correct. She was Diane's teacher. In fact, she was incredibly grateful to this handsome young man because he made her task easier. She saw a free seat next to this boy and didn't know if she could just go and sit on it or if there was some kind of specific order there. But she didn't bother too much, so she sat down next to him and looked at everyone else present. 'Twas quite soon another woman approached Rin. She asked in an anxious voice if she really intended to attract attention to herself from her first day on the job. This woman also asked why the girl came to the celebration dressed like that. Rin was very surprised by such questions. She immediately looked at her appearance and answered that these clothes were just in her closet. So she put them on. She really did not understand what the problem was. She thought that this would be just the right outfit for such an event, but apparently she was mistaken in her judgment. Then another man who was also sitting nearby spoke up. He agreed with his partner and said that this girl was definitely trying to attract attention because she first killed the monster, and now she even put on these clothes. He put his glass of wine on the table and asked the girl, "Isn't it true?" Of course, Rin didn't answer that question. She just sat there politely and smiled. Of course, if she had made a mistake with her clothes, there was no need for a man to be so ignorant. And besides, she didn't understand why they were all so hostile towards her from the very beginning, so the girl, asking for forgiveness, asked if maybe they should introduce themselves first, since they were meeting for the first time, and she didn't even know how to address them properly. After this, the other teacher sighed heavily and looked away from the girl. Arena continued speaking. She said that they all knew her very well, but she did not know them. She also said that she didn't know them, with the exception of Mr. Cheshi, whom she had met a little earlier and had already managed to learn a little about him. The woman with green hair smiled happily and asked if she really didn't know them. And she also said that since the girl came from the elite, she, of course, considered it necessary to pay absolutely no attention to anyone else. This teacher was incredibly hostile towards Rin, and in a stern voice she asked, "Isn't that true?" When the girl heard this, she was incredibly surprised, but she did not make it known to everyone. She just did not understand what was going on at all. That day was her first day on the job as a caregiver in the new mansion as a character, and she didn't know why everyone was treating her like that when she hadn't even gotten to know them yet. Cheshi decided to lighten their bad mood and said that he heard that they had a completely different process for completing their studies. He explained to Rin that since she was different from them, she probably hadn't seen the information from the house elder. In order not to provoke an angry reaction from the other teachers, he said that this was only his opinion and assumption. However, he said that he might be right, so he turned to Mrs. Rin and asked what she thought. The girl didn't quite understand why he was saying all this, but she said that everything was exactly like that. In fact, Cheshi was talking at that moment about a system that transmits information about other educators to new teachers, and it was quite obvious why other people were offended. However, in reality, Rin had no intention of apologizing to them or making excuses. Regardless of the reason, be it a feeling of inferiority or superiority, the girl did not understand how they could sit together with their children, whom they were raising, and allow themselves to behave like that towards a stranger. She believed that this was completely unqualified for a teacher, and that they were certainly setting a terrible example for their children. There was another awkward silence between them, and Cheshi turned to Mr. Ravan, asking if it was true that he had already met Miss Rin, and also asked what he thought about this girl in general. The man also suggested that Rin couldn't recognize him at all, and yet when he had spoken to him alone, the man had said that he had never heard her name in Stella. Raven, hearing all these words, even choked on his wine. He wiped his mouth with a napkin, and laughing, said that this was indeed so. In fact, he honestly said that there was only one tutor from Stella in this estate, and Rin was very surprised that it was really that man. She immediately decided to make sure that she had not made a mistake in her judgments. So, turning to Mr. Cheshi, she asked, "Is this really the same person he spoke about on their walk?" The girl was actually very surprised that if the player chooses the role of a teacher, then by default he is either a Stella native or not. She then decided to observe a little in order to understand the whole situation to the end, and turning to Raven, asked if he really had not heard her name before. The man felt awkward, so he giggled and said that he had only heard about her somewhere in passing. Even though Stella was alone, there were many departments there. So many students didn't even cross paths there. But then the other woman who had been comforting Vivi suddenly spoke up. She said that in any case, she thought they should all introduce themselves, because that would definitely be ignorant. The man raised his glass and said that they really should introduce themselves one by one. The other people were not very happy about this. Rin even thought for a moment that all these people were planning something, but she couldn't check what exactly. From what she heard, she understood that Ruskaya was a calm and cold young man. However, his tutor Marianne was an unfriendly witch who looked like a northerner. From the second room was Manuel, a narcissistic young man with a sharp character and a desire to do everything only the way he wants. His tutor was Cheshi, a man with a pleasant character and beautiful purple eyes. He was also a little naive. In the third room there was a boy named Vivi, a friendly young man who seemed to her to be a very sweet and gentle child. His tutor was Eugenia. She seemed like a smart girl, and Rin even decided that she liked rules. In the fourth room there was a boy named Leo. He was a boy who liked to joke around, and he was bright and active. His tutor was Raven, a smart man, but Rin didn't know if he was really an elite from Stella or just wanted to appear that way. In the fifth room was Serju, a calm and obedient youth with a quiet and peaceful character who does not like to show himself. His tutor was Olivia, a sassy witch who hates and even despises the elite. In the sixth room was Jay, a smart young man, but he was too emotionless and even secretive. His tutor was Gilper. He seemed like a stupid and silent man. He didn't say a single word the whole evening, so Rin couldn't draw any conclusions about his personality. And in the seventh room was Diane, the sweetest, most handsome, most charming young man with ruby-red eyes and white hair flying in the wind. And his tutor, of course, was Rin, Diana's servant, whose appearance she worked tirelessly on. The girl decided that first she needed to sort everything out in her head. However, she also needed to learn all these little portraits before communicating with them normally, because she knew that they would see each other quite often, and it was necessary to have a certain approach to different educators. But she, of course, also very much hoped that the mistake would be corrected fairly quickly, and that they would never have to meet each other again. Soon after, a maid came to her and said that the food was ready, so the other maids also came, and in their hands they had plates with the festive dinner. That evening they had steak and chimichurri sauce on the menu. It was a special dish for the welcome party, so the maids, setting the plates on the table, told them to enjoy this wonderful food. But as soon as the maid opened the ram, she immediately became very frightened. She jumped to the side and said in a trembling voice that she did not know why these things were there at all. But Rin took it completely calmly. She had a corpse flower on her plate, and all the other maids, seeing it, did not expect it, and were even afraid. They did not understand what he was doing there at all. In fact, a red flower blooms when an ordinary person dies. However, the flower on the plate was not a corpse flower at all. It was very similar in shape to him, and was also painted red. Rin didn't know whose handiwork it was, but she knew it was a very bad joke, and these people would regret doing this to her. She smiled and said that the Redford mansion had an interesting way of welcoming guests. Then she pierced the flower with a fork and put it in her mouth.